Well, thank you, Dallas, very much for that. Thank you for starting us off in a good way. I have a Res Dog Walkers hoodie. I wear it all the time. Let me tell you, it's a great hoodie. We're going to move right into our first panel discussion of the day, focus on Indigenous leadership and carbon offsetting. As a reminder to you all, audience members can submit questions for our speakers through Slido. Instructions on how to do this should be on the screens behind me. They're also in the first page of your QR code, or the first QR code is also on the first page of your programs. And with that, I'm pleased to introduce our moderator, Paul Kariya, Acting General Manager of the Great Bear Carbon Credit LP, who will guide us through this important discussion. Please join me in welcoming Paul and his fellow panelists.
Hey. Fireside chat. Thank you, Logan. Good morning, everyone, and thanks for joining us so bright and early. I want to say thanks to the IROC organizers for a wonderful couple of days, and hopefully we add to it with this panel this morning. I want to acknowledge the Nanaimo First Nation, upon whose lands and territories we're meeting, and I'm hoping that this panel on Indigenous leadership and carbon offsetting under the banner of opportunities, that's the theme of the conference, fits in. For some of you, this might be fairly new. For some of you, you might be already engaged as buyers and sellers of offsets. In our 50-minute slot, the objective is to provide you enough information so that you can know where to go to find out more. We can't cover the waterfront on the subject, and nor are we intending to. But hopefully for all of you with different objectives, we'll whet your appetite with the experts that we have here today. So let me introduce the panel. And they are Danielle Warren, our Senior Sales and Operations Manager at the Great Bear Carbon Credit Corporation. We have Michael Berends, CEO of Clear Blue, a Canadian climate solutions company, and I might say a great partner that we work with in terms of the marketplace to sell Great Bear carbon credits in the marketplace. Of course, we have Dallas Smith, the president of Nanwakolas Council, and many, many hats, and friend. And Adria Fradley, who's the ADM, the Ministry of Energy, who is, I think you wear two hats as regulator, and also part of, I think you oversee carbon neutral government too. Yes. So again, some of those titles and terms may be new to you, but we'll get into it in the discussion. I want to reserve as much time as we can for the Q&A and for Slido. And at the end of the panel, we'll give each of the panelists a minute to say whatever they want to say. So with that, why don't we get underway? And I'm going to begin the first question with Danielle Warren. Danny, what are the carbon offset opportunities for First Nations in BC today?
Thank you, Paul. I'll start by, even though the question's about BC, talking a little bit about the context in Canada for carbon markets and specifically for Indigenous people. And you know, we're quite progressive here in British Columbia, and part of that is our government and the Indigenous relationship with government. But the opportunity that we have for carbon as Indigenous people here in BC doesn't exist across most of Canada. And part of that is First Nations and Indigenous people, whether that be Métis or Inuit, having a dialogue with the government. So government first has to be happy to open that door, and that's not an easy door to open, understandably. But nonetheless, without that dialogue there, it's hard to get the rights entitled to carbon to create a project within the market, which I'll get more into a bit later. But it's important to understand that what we have in BC is unprecedented across Canada. Hasn't happened anywhere else in terms of Indigenous-led carbon. And that's something I certainly hope to see the development of in the coming years, as I think as Canada sees its climate goals, there's going to be a need to collaborate with First Nations across the country. It's non-negotiable and it just needs to happen. And so how do we do that in a good way where communities and government can achieve goals together and benefit together? In terms of other opportunities within BC and existing communities here today, there's so many. There's a big list, Paul. This question is like, it's packed, but
Just a summary, Danny.
yeah, I'll try. At a high level, the ability to protect and conserve your territory while creating economic development opportunities from the revenues of carbon offset sales, monies to go towards stewardship, towards getting people back out onto the land, supporting language programs, building structures within community educational programs. Is endless where revenues could be used. And that's just the top of what's possible from carbon offset revenues. But I think in a maybe a broader market perspective is asserting our rights and title to carbon on our traditional territory. And not to throw shade at anybody from government, but asserting rights and title to carbon on Crown lands. And that's substantial. You need that in a carbon marketplace to sell assets, but to have a relationship with government where it can be understood that those rights need to be recognized, that we as Indigenous people already recognize our own rights. So it's a matter of coming together, understanding them, so we can create a project and sell into the marketplace. There's an opportunity to tell our stories of our communities. And as a young person, I was saying earlier this week, as a young person, Indigenous person, I was quite frustrated to answer questions about being Indigenous to people who weren't. And as I've gotten older, I understand how important it is that with the right person asking, that we knowledge share and we tell our stories and we tell our practices where it's appropriate and where it's welcomed. Because that is how, it's not going to be taboo to be Indigenous. That is how we can create space for everybody to sit together, to understand each other and what needs to happen to develop our communities further. Just checking notes. I've already touched on it a bit, but the relationship with the government is a big piece of what we have here in BC. And it's really allowed our communities to create opportunities for self-sufficiency. And so Great Bear carbon projects are fully Indigenous owned by our communities. That's huge. There's no other types of parties that are getting a piece of that pie, if you will. And it's the self-sufficiency that we get from our projects. We sell our offsets into the marketplace, working with great people like Clear Blue Markets. And we own them, and we choose who they go to and how much they sell at. And nobody else determines that for us. So it's a huge opportunity for us to show our faces in the market and to talk about what it is that we do. I'm mindful of time, so I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Danny. With that, then, I'm going to ask Michael, can you provide an overview of the carbon offset market in Canada and British Columbia today? What's the outlook going forward?
This is on? Yes, great. Thank you. I see a question here as well. It's almost along those lines. Straight to the point, it's a mess, actually, except for in BC. So that's the good news. And I'll get back to that. I think the challenge in Canadian carbon pricing is that we actually have a lot of different markets in one country, and it's a bit of a problem. I like to tell the story. I'm from Canada originally, from Toronto. And I moved to Europe 20 years ago, started doing carbon markets in the EU. They have one big carbon market with one big carbon price, and a lot of countries don't like each other in Europe. And then I came back to Canada in 2017, and I thought we all get along, and everyone's going to have one big carbon price, and we don't. We have this mix of every province with doing their own thing, and it's a challenge because you don't have the fungibility and the liquidity that allows the markets to function properly. So we've seen this progression go. It's been challenging. I think you hear a lot of the politics behind carbon pricing in Canada. That's something that's a bit of a shame. Not to play politics, but the recent election has brought some certainty to carbon pricing in Canada, at least for the next little while. BC was already quite certain with the recent election there, so we always thought that was going to be a strong market to bring certainty. And why is that certainty important? I'm sure as the Great Bear Group knows, it takes a long time to develop an offset project. It takes a commitment. And by the time you see your first offsets, it's generally years and years away. So if you don't have that market certainty to have that project have actual revenue streams in the future, you're not going to develop that project. So you need that certainty, and I think in BC you have that certainty. And BC has done a great job of leveraging their previous voluntary carbon market, merging that into their current compliance market, and they have a great program. And I'll say this, I've never seen Indigenous projects in Canada be so successful as they are in BC. And if someone were to say to me, where should I do a project today, I would say in BC. And looking globally at all the projects I've seen in the compliance markets, the only other compliance market, and I'll touch on compliance markets again and why that's so important, that's as strong as BC is the California market. It's the only market where I see Indigenous-led projects throughout the US being brought into the carbon markets and brought into compliance markets, which brings certainty in certain price levels. And BC is the only other place I've seen this to date, nowhere else in Canada, which is a shame. But I think quickly, this is a new market. This is the first year that the BC LBPS market is already a leader in the offset side of things and in Indigenous-led projects.
Thank you, Michael. There's so many angles that we could pursue in this conversation, but I'm going to continue on with the set questions I have here, and hopefully we'll be able to circle back here. Dallas, can you explain why Nanwakolas Council and the Coastal First Nations have this opportunity today? What does it take to get a forest-based carbon offset project going? I know that Danny used the term government to government, but I'll let you riff off that. I know you can because you were there.
Yes, Paul, thank you. That was a long time ago. I think all the previous speakers really hit a lot of the points that were new to us as we went down this road. I think of the Great Bear Rainforest and the War in the Woods, really. For those of you who don't know, I keep talking about the Great Bear just like everybody was there with me walking along. I wasn't mic'd up then, so maybe that was part of the problem. But during the Great Bear Rainforest, there was just huge confrontation, and the environmental movement did a boycott on BC wood products in Europe. And in Germany is where most of BC's pulp and paper products went to because of the massive magazine industry and the paperback industry that was out of Europe. And so it got everybody's attention. And the War in the Woods really started without us in it. The environmentalists, Forest Ethics, Greenpeace, Sierra Club, they were all on the lines up and stopping logging up in the Central Coast and North Central Coast. And we're watching the forest companies go through it, and we'd sort of get dragged in on each side of that equation. And finally, Chief Percy Starr, chief of the Kitasoo Nation, challenged the environmentalists, and he says, we need employment, we have problems, we need people to work, we need the economy, we need all these things. So I challenge you, these protected areas that you're asking for, make them find a way to generate revenue. And Percy really started the dominoes that really started to all fall that eventually, 9-10 years later, led to some of these amazing offset projects. But I think one of the things that really got it going was knowing that there was a potential for that market out there, knowing that people were trying to offset the use of carbon because of diesel burning and gas and flights and all those sorts of things. But it wasn't something we'd ever thought about, so it sounded kind of pie in the sky-ish. And it would sound like first the commitments were it's going to be this much a ton, and it's going to be worth this, and it's going to be worth that. And we were never able to figure any of that out until we actually did it. But one of the things that we had to do to make it right was sit down with the province and agree on who owned the carbon. And so we actually sat down with the province under the Gordon Campbell government, and we got into negotiations. First Nations have always claimed our rights and title over our land, sea, and air resources. It took a while to understand what air meant, and that's really where the carbon side fit into this. But trying to explain that to our communities was a challenge, saying we're going to protect these areas, forego the economic opportunity in logging, which really wasn't ours yet. We weren't getting that yet. And so we had to look at different ways of generating revenue off our lands and resources, and carbon was something that was always dangled in front of us. Then we started a deal with the province. We signed what was called an atmospheric benefit sharing agreement, where we agreed that between us, we collectively owned all the carbon that was created in the province of British Columbia. And so the province agreed with us to sit down and share that. So we agreed that we share it. As the formula started working out and we started finding markets and things just slowly, you figured out one problem at a time. But in the early stages, we all had to commit to it. That was the challenge, was we all had to commit to a spatial planning exercise that carbon was going to be sequestered in. Then we can go on and on about the validation and all that sort of stuff, which is important, but this really started in the mid-90s in Clem 2. In Princess Royal Island, I believe, was where the actual first confrontation happened, where Chief Percy Starr made that challenge to the environmentalists. And to their credit, I mean, they drive me nuts on a regular basis. To their credit, they knew that we had to be part of that equation. They're the first ones who brought us in to these discussions, which ironically made the forest company say, wait, we want you as part of our discussion, which made government say, okay, we need to start sharing revenues. So the actual potential of carbon was really part of the inertia that brought us together on a whole bunch of other issues. So it's been an interesting journey, and I'll have some more to say about how we manage the expectations around carbon, but it really started on a fundamental agreement that between the province and the First Nations, we collectively own the air.
Thanks, Dallas. I think that's a great launch into the background of the carbon offsetting program. Adria, where is BC policy going with carbon offsets and climate action? And maybe end with, so what is this? I think Michael mentioned it, OBPS. And maybe you can give a thumbnail of what the heck that is.
Sorry. Indeed I can. So I do think it is an exciting time for carbon offsets in the offset space right now. BC does have a long history in carbon offsets, beginning in 2008, when we initiated the program. In 2013, there was a provincial audit which really scrutinized a couple of projects, that they weren't additional, it looked like a subsidy because the proponents did not need the carbon offset revenue for that project to succeed. And since that audit, we have really developed a very rigorous offset program, so we can defend it. So it is one of the premium kind of offset markets in the world. We do have like international recognition that BC follows the best practices, because we do not want to have projects out there that are scrutinized because it looks bad on the project proponent, it looks bad on the government. So we want these offset projects to really stand up to any criticisms, because offsets, they can be controversial to some, but they also provide real reductions, Indigenous reconciliation, and other stewardship benefits. So since the audit, we've been developing a lot of working on protocols, working on expanding the market, including the voluntary market. And Danny and Michael can speak to this, but our offsets can trade internationally. They can trade to US-based companies with ESG goals, whether they're sports franchises and banks, which is pretty cool for a compliance grade market. In 2023, we announced 2 new programs to really, that will have an impact on carbon offset market. One is the Net Zero LNG 2030 and Net Zero New Industry. And that requires all new industry, so industry going through the EA, to be net zero, meaning if you're an LNG facility at 2030, you have to offset to zero emissions every year after 2030, which is a significant ambition. The second thing we did was introduce the output-based pricing system. So we went from a carbon tax system to an output-based pricing system for industry. And it's large industry, anything from pulp mills to sawmills to oil and gas, mining, to steel ball manufacturing, sugar, and all of these industries will be looking for offsets as part, I expect, as part of their, to meet their compliance obligations. So what OBPS does is it sets a benchmark for each of these sectors. And sectors and facilities that go under the benchmark, they earn credits that they can hold or sell. If you're a sugar facility and you're over the benchmark, you have to pay a portion of that revenue to government at the carbon tax rate, and then a portion you can use offsets for. And so there are facilities out there that will be looking to purchase offsets from Michael and Danny, essentially. And so each year, I think it is another thing about the OBPS which makes it unique, each year the benchmark tightens, so it gets more stringent, and the carbon price goes up. So it continues to drive reductions, and it continues to get tougher on large industries, likely making the demand larger.
Thanks, Adria. Go ahead, Danny.
Just chiming off of what you said, Adrian, thank you, is compliance market is very exciting for our communities and what's possible. And I think being an Indigenous-led, fully owned project, I work for the Indigenous-led business that sells those offsets, is that we have a voice in a regulated compliance market to tell our story, to connect communities with industry, with heavy emitters where appropriate, where needed. And the opportunities for a pricing in compliance markets is higher, so revenues for relationships to be built and further reconciliation that can happen through this work. And I've always, part of the reason I got into this space was to wanting to put towards First Nations reconciliation of my own people. Now I'm from out east, but nonetheless, what the offset revenues do, going back to community self-sufficiency, the business, having a voice in compliance markets, all of these pieces are different forms of reconciliation. It's us, Indigenous people, having a seat at the table to have a voice, to be able to put forward into that program and to share our knowledge and our experience of how we can work together. Thanks.
Maybe I just on that, Danny, ask both you and Dallas. I mean, these revenues belong to the nations, and I think both of you have been clear on that. Having said that, could you talk a little bit about the linkage between stewardship and carbon offsetting for the participating nations?
Yeah, thanks, Paul. As we've worked these things out with the province, we were negotiating agreements like the Strategic Engagement Agreement. Great Bear and Nanwakolas negotiated the first in the province. There's probably about 80 of them that exist now, but then those got followed up by reconciliation protocol agreements, which gave us the ability to sell carbon together. And so one of the commitments we made to each other was, as we're both the province and First Nations figuring out how to build these carbon projects, we agreed that we were going to use part of the proceeds to pay for the implementation of some of these agreements. So it was really one of the first, instead of, I didn't want to give Premier Ford too much latitude again, but instead of going hat in hand for project after project, we agreed that we were going to take some of the revenues off the top of these projects and just continue to enhance the government-to-government relationships, which eventually led to forest revenue and range sharing and some other things like that. But just having the ability to sit down with a potential fund of capital and dollars at the day, revenue at the end of the day, and agree to how we could prioritize some of those goals and some of those projects that we were working on really helped grow the government-to-government relationship to a point where it got so much far beyond carbon. But carbon's really one of the foundations of the relationship that we have with the province of British Columbia and the Great Bear Rainforest.
Thank you, Dallas. It's hard to follow you, I'm not gonna lie. Something coming from a market perspective, there's a lot of scrutiny on carbon projects and what makes a good carbon project. You can go online right now and find an offset for $1, $3. Our average price per ton on the voluntary market's about $21 right now. So we're doing well. But that said, there's again a need. What's a good project? What kind of program does it come from? There's been a lot of scrutiny to voluntary market projects. And there is a lot of great voluntary market projects. However, we're not a voluntary project. We can sell into those markets, but we are a compliance-based project. created under BC's offset system. It's high stringency. The integrity of offsets is huge in terms of where does the revenues go? Whose pocket does that money end up in once the offsets are sold? And for us, as we've said, it goes back to our communities. It goes back to stewardship and economic development. And you need that in a carbon marketplace. You need to be able to prove that good things are happening from the revenues of the sale of the offsets. And for us, again, it's a lot of it's stewardship. Earlier, Dallas mentioned that the community signed atmospheric benefit sharing agreements with the province of BC. And in essence, in a carbon marketplace, that's a document that says this community has the rights to carbon. It's written down in paper. Again, we already know that, but it has to be written down somewhere in a carbon marketplace to show that ownership. And to really prove the value of those, prove the reality that they're real and created for in market. Sorry, I had a really great point. It's sliding off my table a little bit, but yeah, in essence, Indigenous-led projects are huge in the carbon marketplace. We've certainly seen, again, scrutinies to voluntary markets, and we've had a great amount of success over the last few years. I think because of that scrutiny, it's been allowed us to stand in a very strong place within the market, to tell our story, and to work in a program where we know the offsets are high integrity, they have long-term permanence, local leakage factors, and again, that additionality piece, that word meaning, where do the revenues go? What is there an actual need? In terms of stewardship and the linkage, I think about carbon offset projects, protection, conservation to traditional territories, stopping destructive logging practices and moving to good practices in the small portions of the project area where there still might be logging happening, because we won't pretend that that doesn't happen because there's a carbon project in place. There is still a small percentage that happens. And then I'll just go back again to that stewardship piece. So in our atmospheric benefit agreements, 65% of proceeds are required to go towards stewardship activities. The reality is that it's much more than 65% that the communities actually need. The needs of stewardship is high. A lot of the work our communities do is around protecting our territories, around creating opportunities on the land that benefit the communities, that create jobs, and restore biodiversity where it's needed. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thanks, Danny. Michael, can you explain the difference between the voluntary and compliance markets? You gave in your previous answer the complexity within Canada, but maybe begin just with that separation of voluntary and compliance, and you can riff on that however you like because you know the marketplace.
Yeah, no, thank you. So the voluntary market is exactly that. It's a voluntary decision to offset your emissions as a corporate, as an entity, to say we're going to go net zero, net neutral, whatever the terminology you want to use, to offset your emissions. And they do that on a voluntary initiative, and they go to the market and they decide whatever they want to purchase, and they maybe want to purchase a project where their locations are, in their industry and such, and that's their decision to do, and no one forces anyone to do that. And just to quickly touch on that, I'm quite adamant against the concept of greenwashing. The reality is, no CO actually wants to do that. They rather not pay for anything and not have any emissions. So the fact that you're buying emissions and buying these offsets means you now have more of incentive to reduce your own emissions before someone that's not doing that. Because there's a cost to your emissions that you've now put onto yourself. So that's the voluntary market, and there's a lot of issues there. The reality is as well that nothing's perfect, including not every single offset project's perfect, and we learn as we go forward. But overall, I can finally say it's a positive thing. Offsets are a positive thing. Now, we come to the compliance markets, that's the opposite. You're regulated to actually have to reduce your emissions in some sort of manner, and there's a price that you must pay for those emissions, and that's the compliance market. You can overlap, and just because you're compliant in a market doesn't mean you've done anything for your net neutral activities. In this case, you can use for your compliance 50% offsets in BC this year, or you can pay the whole amount to the BC government. Why would you buy offsets and not rather pay the BC government? Is because it should be cheaper. That's the whole point. It's cheaper, plus the other benefits of supporting the local communities and supporting the projects. But maybe to put some numbers on this, to take a bit of a side here, it's all public data, so I can share a lot of this. the market is dominated by Indigenous-led, in BC that is, Indigenous-led projects, which is a great thing. This conference today is a perfect platform to talk about offsets in BC and the LBPS market. There's millions of offsets, probably hundreds of thousands of offsets generated every year from Indigenous projects in BC. Generally speaking, I'm not to give the prices that these projects are selling at necessarily, but generally, as I mentioned, you're only going to buy an offset project, an offset, rather than pay the government if it's cheaper. So generally speaking, it's 10 to 20% cheaper. The carbon price for 2024, which is now what you're paying this year, is $80. So you can do the math, you times that by millions, it's a lot of money. And I think what's really important here is not every compliance market, meaning the regulators, the governments, actually allow for offsets. Many say the only opportunity is to buy allowances or pay the carbon price to the government. The BC government has decided to say we allow offsets, and in the current situation, most of those offsets are owned by Indigenous groups, and that means that revenue is going back to those groups, which is a great thing for the local community. So it's all adding up, and you'll see more and more of this happening, and I think it's kudos to the government. It's kudos to the groups that were early on looking at this, and again, as I mentioned, it takes a long time. What's amazing here is you're prepared for this market right away. The revenues are coming in today, I think literally, and that's you never see that in a carbon market. I'll be happy to talk about all the ups and downs of other markets, but I've never seen that happen so quickly, where the actual revenue streams are going to the local developers right away. And I think that was a great decision by the BC government to bring in what they had brought in from early on the voluntary side, shifting that into the compliance side, and you're actually seeing that revenue come immediately into the communities.
Can I just jump in? So we do primarily have Indigenous projects in our market, and they are primarily forest carbon offset projects. We are exploring different protocols to have different types of projects right now. We are exploring blue carbon, though it does seem tricky right now. We'd be happy to talk later about that, as well as timber vaulting, which is burying timber burying biomass underground to sequester the methane permanently. It's in its early stages, but there is potential. It would reduce wildfire as well. And just how we do protocols, how we develop protocols, I think is important. We take ideas, we look to other regulators and other programs. We see if it would work in BC, and we start engaging. For those of you who know the BC offset market, we recognize that the forest carbon offset protocol took a long time.
Sorry. Is that audible?
That's normal. That's normal.
It is normal, but I think after multiple engagement rounds, I think we got to a good place. So the more bespoke the offset protocol it is, the longer it will take to get the science right, to get the engagement right, to get the consultation done. It is easier if the math is already there and we can just adopt it to a BC situation and then go and consult and engage. But if there are future ideas, we are wanting to hear.
Maybe before Danny, just for Adria, could you tell us about how is the BC government carbon neutral in its operations?
For sure. So BC's been carbon neutral since 2008. And so what that means is that BC buys offsets to offset its own emissions from its buildings, from its hospitals, from its schools, from its fleet vehicles, from all government travel. And so every year we do a request for proposals, and we start purchasing offsets to make BC government carbon neutral. And until the compliance market came in, until OBPS was enacted, this was a large source of, a large buyer of BC offsets.
Thanks, Adria. I think it was just pre-COVID when Minister Heyman, Minister of the Day, and Chief Doug Niesloss went to the UN to receive an award for one of the first subnational states in the world to achieve carbon neutrality. So, Danny?
Trying to remember what my point is.
Sorry to interrupt.
I always use this as an excuse, but my baby's almost 10 months and mom brain is real. Oh yes, just the stringency. You know, Adria's made a comment about how long it took to have the forest carbon offset protocol come to market. You know, I think people might feel frustrated by that at times. However, I think the benefit is now is this high integrity program that we have with really strong carbon offsets in the market. Like Adria's highlighted, provinces has been audited, and we can defend our projects and we can defend the integrity of the offsets. So in a lot of ways that's benefited Great Bear and communities by having a strong projects in the marketplace. And yeah, I think the wait has certainly been worth it, and we've really seen the benefit of that hard work, so appreciated.
Thanks, Danny. Maybe a comment I'd make there is that we've, in the panel here, been maybe upselling the positive side, and we would encourage First Nations to explore the opportunity. But the comment I'd add is that it is terribly expensive, money-wise, not just the dollar outlay to do the auditing and that kind of work, but there needs to be some real serious expertise in terms of the consulting side that has to have been retained to do the modeling and that. So it's not an easy step to say, oh, we'll just do it, or it's as simple as planting a few trees. It's not like that at all. Maybe what we can do is turn to Slido. I recognize that there are questions there, and we've been answering questions that we had prepared in advance somewhat. The first one is, what advice would you give to Indigenous communities? Oh, it just changed on me. The first one is, what advice would you give to Indigenous communities that are beginning to explore carbon offsetting? And I'm going to let the panel, all of them, if they would like to comment on that.
Sure. Please feel free to reach out to myself, or I'll give you an email, ghdregulator@gov.bc.ca. We do think, if you have any questions, ask early. It is a long journey for offsets. It can be expensive. We want to be as transparent, and it can be complicated. So we are happy to talk about this stuff and engage from an early stage. And it's really important to get the order of operations right, starting with the atmospheric benefit, and we can help with that.
I love that passion. I do, I really do. When I think about communities exploring the opportunity, there's a lot to it, and the cost. And I think, usually community will start with a feasibility. Is this even worth spending the time and effort and money on? Which I think is the right step. But I think two other pieces that are very important that come to mind, and there is a lot in this. This could be a whole other panel. One is the government-to-government relationship. So that's the First Nations government coming with their provincial government, or the federal government under that offset system. Different conversation. Nonetheless, is that needs to happen. That needs to be there, because again, in a carbon marketplace, you need to have that rights and title reflected somewhere to hold the offsets and to show that ownership to be able to sell them. So that's one piece, is that government-to-government relationship needs to be there. And then the second is who you're working with. Assuming a community doesn't have, hundreds of thousands of dollars or however their project may cost to develop, who are you working with in order to develop that project, and what are their values? Because it's of my mind, if there's an Indigenous-based project, it should be majority owned, even if that's 51%, by the Indigenous community, not by the project developer or the investor. And unfortunately, there are a lot of carbon cowboys that we see in the marketplace that are looking to develop a project on whatever type of land to be able to get those revenues onto their bottom line. And I'd like to think there are less and less of those in the marketplace today. It's harder for them to create, but they are still there. And so if a community is looking at developing, who are you working with and what are their values? And I think, I hear sometimes from industry, how frustrating it is for them to feel like I have to wait forever to get a response from that community, or it took them a year to decide they wanted to work with us. We'll take that time and get to know them. Take that time to establish a relationship. We're basically saying we're going to eat dinner at the same table every night. Well, let's get to know each other a little bit first before we do that and be in that relationship together. That time is essential for the community to be able to, for you to understand their values, for them to understand how you work, and to know that you want to proceed together. And so that time is critical. Carbon offset projects, unfortunately, though, do need to be developed quickly, so I get there's some timelines that are difficult to be met, but nonetheless, that period is important. So yeah, majority ownership, values, and what are the technicalities of the project? Like, who actually is managing the offsets in the marketplace once they've been created? In Great Bear's case, it's us, we do it ourselves, and then we work with people, other players in the market. But a lot of times it's the developer or the investor that holds the tons, the offset tons, we use that term a lot, tons, later, and they sell them. They make the decision to who they go to and to who is buying and to how much they're being sold at. So is there Indigenous voices going to be in that part of the project? Project's been developed, we're on market. Well, who is actually selling the offsets, and where is that money going? Is the investor developer getting a cut? Right? Is there some other party that invested that's also getting a cut? There's so many technicalities in there that people don't think. They just figure, we're going to start a carbon project. Oh, that's great. But there's so much more. Again, those percentages, the real business negotiation part that I think sometimes isn't always clear, unfortunately, as we hear from the, again, the carbon cowboys.
Maybe just very quickly, Paul, you mentioned as well that it can be complicated and technical. So I think the advice I'd give is make sure you're working with groups that understand carbon offsets. It's not easy. It's a lengthy process, all the engagement on just the technical side of things. And, I've seen more offset projects in my time go wrong than go right. And that can be a good thing because it has to be a rigorous process, so it's not easy to get them, and they're not just given out easy like candy. But you can have a good project that can go wrong or be delayed extensively because you didn't do the proper paperwork, you didn't do the proper processes. So start off right, work with people that have done this before, not the new players in the markets that maybe think they can do something, because I think a lot of lessons learned helps a lot in this business. So that's probably my most important advice is find people that have done this before.
Thanks, Michael. Dallas, did you want to respond to that question too?
Yeah, I think, a lot's been said about how important the relationship is to start, and that's sort of been the theme of the conference this week. But I think as First Nations communities, is just understanding what you're getting into, and really what the hook for us was, this was a way to establish our Aboriginal rights connection to air resources. And that opened up the discussion to start talking about blue carbon. Blue carbon is something that's going to be fascinating over the time. We have hectares and hectares and hectares of kelp in our territories. And we've actually spent probably $4 or $5 million on trying to understand how much carbon is sequestered by kelp. Sits on the ocean, soaks in the sun, but we've also realized that as kelp shreds and it starts to grow out of itself, the carbon is sequestered in the droppings, I don't know how I put that, in the waste that falls down to the ocean floor, and we're still in the process of understanding how long that's sequestered for. Is it a viable carbon project? And so it's been interesting to see that we started with one discussion that was painfully slow, but it got us to a point that we said, now we need to look at this. Now we need to look at that. And thankfully, regardless of the political stripe over the last few years, the government of British Columbia, the Crown of British Columbia, has been willing to continue to walk down this path with us. And that's one of the things that we need to do now is talk with the federal government, because we are talking about blue carbon. So there's different jurisdictional issues that are going to come up in this that you just need to understand are going to be part of this discussion. And I was big on the whole school of, I have rights entitled to this, that, and other. I don't give a crap what anybody else thinks. That's not reality. The reality is the two other levels of Crown have legislation that's needed to take this together. And so the fact that we've been able to learn through this together and start to amend and build better policy around making this more of an enabling process as opposed to just to be a carrot for more conservation. This is actually a functioning part of the economy now. And so as Indigenous nations go down in that, you need to be very clear that you're establishing your right to the air resources within your territory. And that's why those atmospheric benefit sharing agreements are so important.
I see time has moved on here, and we probably should get to final comments from each of you. Maybe I'll begin with Michael.
Sure, I think very quickly, I definitely see the time here. And I think it's a theme, Dallas, of you throughout the conferences, and Danny, you mentioned as well, offset projects are long-term relationships. You're working with whoever the developer may be, Indigenous or non-Indigenous. It's a long-term relationship. We've always stressed, the contractual agreement you get into, it has to work for both parties for a long time. The relationship has to be there together, to work there, to get the results over time, because I'll end it on this, an offset project exists over a period of years, 10, 20 years. Every year it generates offsets. You need to have a relationship where every year you're working together to get the benefit of those offsets.
Thanks, Michael. Adria?
Yeah, just building off what Michael said, if there are questions from people who think they have an offset project, think they have an offset protocol idea, do reach out. We want, government's job in this space is to enable a market, and that's what we want to do. And so we need to work together to develop those protocols. We don't know if there's not interest in certain areas. I saw someone mentioned a biochar. That is on our list. So we want to start developing more and more in the protocols, diversifying the market.
Speaking to communities who might have interest, the opportunity for carbon is right now really with climate action just at the forefront, with Indigenous peoples and reconciliation at the forefront, I think, of world media in a lot of ways, but also the need to offset, the need to meet our net zero goals over time. And so the time is now. If it's an interest, then start pursuing it and start seeing what it might actually look like within your own community and developing those relationships. As I think Michael might have mentioned, knowledge sharing. Go to people who are already doing it. I think Paul and I have had, in Dallas, I'm sure, several conversations with communities that are interested in developing a project. The way we grow and be powerful together is by knowledge sharing and understanding the work that's been done before us. And I'm always happy to share, as Adria's kind of sort of said shamelessly, hey, this is how you can contact us, same as well. So knowledge sharing being part of that. But then going back to industry or to project developers or to investors who want to create these opportunities, know that what you're doing is not just creating an offset project. You're you're working with Indigenous people to help create opportunities for their communities to put towards protection of the lands, towards stewardship, towards reconciliation, and really healing for Indigenous peoples in Canada, which is at the heart of this. That's at the heart of this work for me. And what are the real benefits of the project? Where do those revenues go? What are they used for? And how is the land protected, conserved? How does biodiversity grow? How do people connect with the land? And as an Indigenous person, being a young person, it was just a given for me. I'm on the land. I grew up on the land, knew how to fish, knew a little bit about hunting. That was just a given. Come to the city where a lot of people don't know that. When people get back into their community and they get these opportunities, that's healing. That's a part of reconciliation. And so when you're developing an offset project, keep that in mind of the human life that is being benefited from the development of this work.
Dallas?
Talk about being hard to follow. Jeez. Touche. I think one of the things I've learned on this journey is just to manage the expectations. In the beginning, it was a carrot that was dangled to achieve somebody else's goal. And then we were able to embrace that and work with our provincial partners at a government-to-government level. I think that's the key. Is we keep forgetting, even though we get involved in these businesses and we have limited partnerships that develop these opportunities, it's fundamental to have that government-to-government relationship to make sure you have a place as decision makers to continue to unroll this. But it's also a long journey, as been said by each of my colleagues. It's kind of like when you get in a car with the kids. Are we there yet? Are we there yet? Are we there yet? And while it's turned out into a wonderful thing, in the early days, we were selling it for $7 a ton. You know, that was the reality of the day. This carbon market that was supposed to bring us $20 to $25 a ton just never really developed in front of us when it was supposed to. And so having the ability to stay the course and the discipline to keep seeing that your destination is there, but it's just going to take a little bit longer to get there. And in the early days, I know we told the chiefs, like when it was $7 a ton, they're like, well, you keep telling us this is going to be a rewarding venture that's going to bring us economic certainty and opportunity. And in the early years, it was like having a house party, sort of like last night, where you found the change under the couch at the end of the night. And that was kind of what it was in the beginning. It was kind of, we'd bring everybody together and we'd talk about carbon and we'd make some sales, and the province was our biggest buyer in the early years because the market hadn't created itself yet. And so having to tell the chiefs, okay, well, we found a bunch of nickels under this couch, a bunch of quarters under this couch, but it all added up. It all got reinvested back into the community. So just staying the course and having the patience and perseverance and a relationship that can stay that course together is really what made some of these projects successful. So thanks, Paul.
Thank you, panel. I know Logan's standing by here. There was a question about young people, and I should say that there is a certificate program in carbon offsetting at UBC, and I think we offer a bursary or a scholarship, don't we, Danny?
For a year. We've budgeted for it in new fiscal.
Okay, good show. Thanks very much.
Well, thank you very much, Paul, and to the whole panel. It takes a lot of bravery to be the first panel of the day, especially after a long night of karaoke, so we're very grateful that you guys were able to do that. We have a small speaker gift for you all on behalf of the conference. Don't go anywhere. We have our next session coming up in about 30 seconds.